The afternoon sun hung low over the Ruhr Valley on March 28, 1945, casting long shadows across the shattered industrial landscape that had once been the beating heart of German war production. Hauptmann Ernst Schafer stood in what remained of a factory courtyard, his uniform filthy from weeks of continuous retreat, watching as his company commander gathered the remaining officers for what everyone knew would be their final briefing. The exhaustion in every man's face told a story that no propaganda broadcast could ever conceal. They were finished, and they all knew it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Schafer had served with distinction in Army Group B for nearly 4 years, first as a logistics officer coordinating supply lines across France, then as a company commander when casualties had created unexpected opportunities for advancement. He had survived the Normandy campaign, the desperate fighting in the Falaise pocket, and the chaotic retreat across the Rhine. But nothing in his military training or combat experience had prepared him for what was happening now. The German army wasn't just retreating anymore. It was disintegrating, unit by unit, man by man, as the reality of absolute defeat became impossible to deny. Around him, the remnants of what had once been a full-strength infantry division huddled in small groups among the ruins of the Krupp steelworks. Young soldiers, barely old enough to shave, sat next to weathered veterans who had fought from Poland to the gates of Moscow. Waffen SS officers stood apart from Wehrmacht regulars, the traditional rivalries persisting even as their entire world collapsed. No one spoke much anymore. There was nothing left to say. The promised wonder weapons had never materialized. The supposed relief armies existed only in Berlin's propaganda broadcasts. The war was lost, and everyone from the lowest private to the highest-ranking officers understood this with absolute clarity. The encirclement of the Ruhr pocket had begun in early March, when American forces from the north and south linked up near Lippstadt, trapping over 300,000 German troops in an area roughly 60 miles across. Within days, that number had swelled to nearly 500,000, as retreating units fled into what they thought would be a defensive position. Instead, they had trapped themselves in a cage with walls made of American artillery and air power. The pocket was shrinking daily, as American forces methodically compressed the perimeter, and everyone inside knew that surrender was not a question of if, but when. Schafer had watched his division's strength melt away over the past 3 weeks. Desertions were constant now, with entire companies simply walking away from their positions during the night. Others surrendered at the first sight of American patrols, waving white flags made from torn undershirts or bedsheets looted from abandoned homes. The military police tried to maintain discipline with threats of summary execution, but even the hardest SS officers had begun to realize that shooting deserters was pointless when the entire army was falling apart. Food was nearly gone. Ammunition was critically low. Medical supplies had run out weeks ago, leaving wounded men to suffer with nothing but dirty bandages and hope. The factory where Schafer's unit had taken shelter showed the futility of their situation with brutal clarity. American bombing had reduced the massive industrial complex to twisted metal and collapsed concrete. The machinery that had once produced tank armor and artillery shells lay scattered like broken toys across acres of devastation. Nothing worked. Nothing could be salvaged. The destruction was so complete, so methodical, that it spoke to capabilities that Schafer had never fully comprehended during the years of fighting. The Americans had not just defeated German industry. They had erased it from existence with surgical precision and overwhelming.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
His company had been assigned to defend a sector of the perimeter near Essen 3 days ago, a task that would have been laughable if it weren't so deadly serious. They had no heavy weapons, minimal ammunition, and perhaps 60 men fit for combat. Against them was arrayed the full might of American mechanized warfare, supported by artillery that fired around the clock and air power that owned the sky so completely that German soldiers had learned to freeze at the sound of any aircraft engine. Defending anything was impossible. Survival had become the only realistic objective, and even that was looking increasingly unlikely. The briefing began with their battalion commander, a grizzled Oberstleutnant named Dietrich, who had lost an eye at Stalingrad and wore his wounds like medals. His remaining eye swept across the assembled officers with something that looked like grief. He did not waste time with false encouragement or tactical fantasies. Instead, he stated the facts with brutal honesty. American forces had broken through their defensive line to the north. The retreat route to the east was cut off. Ammunition supplies would last perhaps 2 more days of serious fighting. Food was already exhausted. They had 3 options, and none of them were good. They could attempt a breakout, fighting their way through American lines in a desperate bid to reach what remained of German forces to the east. This would almost certainly result in massive casualties, and likely fail completely given their lack of ammunition and the Americans' complete air superiority. They could remain in position and fight to the last man, a course of action that would achieve nothing except adding their names to the growing list of pointless sacrifices. Or they could surrender, accepting captivity but preserving the lives of the men under their command. Dietrich made no recommendation. He simply laid out the options and told his officers to make their choices. The war was ending, whether they liked it or not. Schafer found himself thinking about the men he commanded, boys mostly, conscripts pulled from civilian life in the desperate final months of the war. They had families waiting for them in towns and villages across Germany. Mothers who had already lost husbands and other sons to this war. Sisters who needed their brothers to help rebuild shattered lives. What right did he have to order these boys to die for a cause that was already lost? The oath they had sworn meant nothing now. The state they had pledged to defend was collapsing into chaos. Continuing to fight would not change the outcome of the war. It would only add more names to casualty lists that no one would remember. The meeting broke up without any formal decisions being made. Officers drifted away to their units, each man left to wrestle with choices that would define the rest of their lives. Schafer walked through the ruins toward where his company had established a makeshift position among collapsed walls and overturned machinery. The men looked up as he approached, their faces showing the peculiar combination of hope and dread that came from knowing that decisions were being made that would determine their fates. He told them nothing yet. There was nothing to tell. But he knew what his choice would be. He had known since the moment Dietrich had spoken the word surrender. That evening, as darkness fell across the Ruhr Valley, the sounds of combat intensified along the southern edge of the pocket. American artillery opened up with a barrage that shook the ground and lit the sky with orange flashes. Small arms fire crackled in the distance, indicating that some German units were still fighting, still trying to hold positions that could not be held. Schafer listened to the battle and felt something inside him finally break. He had done his duty. He had served honorably. But this was over. Continuing to fight was not courage, it was suicide, and it would accomplish nothing except adding more bodies to the pyres. He gathered his sergeants after midnight and told him his decision. They would surrender at first light. Not as defeated enemies, but as men who had done their duty and fought into the last possible moment. They would follow Schafer leading them into the surrender lines, but without tension. No symbols. The flag should not be raised, the song should not be sung. The decision was made to simply surrender and survive.
Soldiers who had fought well and lost to a superior force. They would march out in formation, weapons slung, and present themselves to the nearest American unit under a flag of truce. Some of the sergeants protested, arguing that surrender was dishonor, that they should fight until their ammunition ran out. But most simply nodded, with relief visible on their faces. They understood what Schafer understood. The war was lost. Dying now would not change that. It would only deny them the chance to rebuild the lives and nation that this war had destroyed. The night passed slowly, marked by the distant sounds of battle and the occasional rumble of American tanks moving through the darkness. Schafer did not sleep. He sat in the ruins of what had once been a factory office, surrounded by scattered papers and broken furniture, and thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had believed once, believed in the righteousness of Germany's cause and the inevitability of German victory. Those beliefs had been ground away by years of retreat and defeat, replaced by a hollow understanding that everything he had been told was lies. The war had been lost from the beginning. They had been fighting and dying for nothing. Dawn came gray and cold, with low clouds that promised rain. Schafer assembled his company in the factory courtyard, perhaps 50 men who could still march in formation. He had ordered them to clean their uniforms as best they could, to shave if they had razors, to present themselves with whatever dignity they could muster. They would not surrender as a mob of broken men. They would surrender as soldiers, maintaining the only thing they had left, their self-respect. A white flag was fashioned from a torn sheet, mounted on a broken broom handle. It looked pathetic, but it would serve its purpose. Other units were making similar decisions across the pocket. The military police had given up trying to prevent surrenders, focusing instead on maintaining order in the shrinking German-held territory. SS officers who threatened to shoot deserters found themselves isolated and ignored as regular Wehrmacht units simply walked away from their positions. The great German army that had conquered most of Europe was dissolving like morning fog, and nothing could stop it. The collapse had its own momentum now, accelerating with each hour as more units laid down their weapons and sought the safety of American captivity. Schafer led his company out of the factory complex at 7 in the morning, marching in column formation along a road that had once carried materials to feed the German war machine. They walked past abandoned positions, past burned-out vehicles, past the hastily dug graves of men who had died in the final pointless battles of the pocket's collapse. Other German units watched them go, some with contempt, others with envy. By noon, most of those units would also be surrendering. The trickle of men seeking captivity was becoming a flood, and soon it would be a torrent that would sweep away the last remnants of German military resistance in the West. They encountered their first American patrol within an hour of leaving the factory. The Americans appeared from behind the ruins of a bombed-out apartment building, a squad of infantry supported by a Sherman tank that had its main gun trained on the approaching German column. Schafer raised the white flag high and ordered his men to halt. For a long moment, nothing happened. The Americans watched them with weapons ready, clearly uncertain about whether this was a genuine surrender or some kind of trap. Then an American officer stepped forward, a young lieutenant who looked barely older than some of Schafer's conscripts, and asked in hesitant German what they wanted. Schafer responded in what English he knew, supplemented with gestures and the universal language of defeat. His company was surrendering. They had no more ammunition to fight with. They wished to be taken as prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. The American lieutenant looked almost as uncertain as
Schafer felt, probably facing his first mass surrender and unsure of proper procedures. He spoke into a radio handset, reporting the situation to someone higher up the chain of command. Then he told the Germans to stack their weapons and wait for transportation to be arranged. The disarmament process was awkward, but not hostile. German soldiers laid down rifles, pistols, and the few remaining stick grenades they had carried. American soldiers collected the weapons without taunts or abuse, treating the process with professional efficiency. Schafer surrendered his own sidearm, a Walther pistol that had been with him since France, feeling a strange sense of loss as he handed it to an American sergeant. That pistol had been a symbol of his authority, his status as an officer and a fighting man. Without it, he was just another defeated enemy, indistinguishable from the privates and corporals in his command. They waited in the ruins for nearly 2 hours while American logistics organized transportation. During that time, Schafer had his first real opportunity to observe his captors at close range. What he saw confused and disturbed him in ways he had not anticipated. The American soldiers were young, casually dressed,
and seemed almost relaxed, despite being in what was technically still a combat zone. They shared cigarettes among themselves, laughed at jokes that Schafer could not understand, and treated the whole situation with an informality that seemed completely at odds with military discipline as he understood it. More striking was the equipment the Americans carried and used. Every soldier had an M1 rifle that looked well-maintained and new. Their uniforms were clean, properly fitted, and made from material that looked far superior to the increasingly shoddy fabric that German factories had been producing. They wore helmets that appeared to be standardized and of high quality. Their boots were sturdy and waterproof. Everything about them spoke of an army that had unlimited access to resources and manufacturing capability. The contrast with German forces, who had been making do with recycled materials and ersatz substitutes for years, was stark and undeniable. The American officer returned with news that trucks were en route to transport the German prisoners to a collection point. He offered Schafer a cigarette from a pack of Lucky Strikes, an American brand that Schafer had heard of but never seen. The cigarette was fresh, properly made with real tobacco, nothing like the harsh substitutes that German soldiers had been smoking for the past year. Schafer accepted it with thanks and lit it carefully, savoring the taste of something that had become a luxury in Germany. The American lieutenant smoked his own cigarette with casual indifference, clearly unaware that what he was treating as routine was a rare pleasure for his prisoner. Trucks arrived within the hour, proper military transport vehicles with canvas covers and bench seating in the cargo beds. The Americans loaded the German prisoners efficiently, organizing them by rank and ensuring that everyone was accounted for on manifests. The manifests themselves impressed Schafer with their thoroughness. Each prisoner's name, rank, and unit were recorded on pre-printed forms using multiple carbon copies. The Americans were processing prisoners with the same systematic organization that might be used for routine supply requisitions, demonstrating administrative capabilities that suggested vast resources and careful planning. The truck convoy began moving south, away from the fighting, and toward what the Americans called holding areas. Schafer sat in the back of a truck with his senior sergeants, watching the landscape roll past through gaps in the canvas covering. What he saw confirmed his growing understanding that Germany had lost more than just a military conflict. They had lost to a civilization that operated on a completely different scale of organization and capability. The roads were filled with American military traffic moving with purposeful efficiency. Supply convoys carried materials forward to combat units. Ambulances transported wounded soldiers to aid stations. Military police directed traffic at intersections with hand signals and whistles. Everything moved according to plans that seemed to work exactly as intended. The destruction of German infrastructure was visible everywhere they passed. Bridges had been knocked down with precision. Railway facilities had been systematically demolished. Every strategic target that might support German military operations had been identified and destroyed, not randomly, but as part of a careful campaign that had left German forces unable to move supplies or reinforcements. The Americans had not just won battles, they had dismantled the entire foundation of German military capability with methodical thoroughness that spoke to intelligence gathering and planning capabilities that far exceeded anything Germany had possessed. They passed through several small towns that had been recently captured by American forces. German civilians stood in doorways and watched the trucks pass, their faces showing the same exhaustion and defeat that Schafer felt. The Americans had established military government offices in some of these towns, with signs in both English and German directing civilians to various administrative functions. Curfew notices were posted on walls. Regulations about civilian conduct under occupation were clearly stated. The Americans were not just occupying territory, they were systematically administering it, transforming conquered areas into functioning societies under American control. The organizational capacity required for such administration while simultaneously conducting combat operations was staggering to consider. The convoy stopped after several hours at what the Americans called a forward prisoner collection point, a hastily established facility in an open field that had been converted into a temporary processing center. Thousands of German soldiers were already there, sitting in organized groups while American personnel worked through the administrative requirements of handling mass surrenders. The scale of the operation was overwhelming. American trucks arrived continuously with new groups of prisoners. American personnel worked at tables processing paperwork. American military police maintained order without apparent effort. Everything functioned with an efficiency that seemed impossible given the numbers involved. Schafer and his company were directed to a holding area where they joined several hundred other German prisoners awaiting processing. The American guards maintained watch, but showed no hostility toward their charges. They were simply doing their job, following procedures that had apparently been established in advance to handle exactly this situation. The prisoners were allowed to sit, to talk among themselves, and to rest after the stress of surrender. Water was provided in large containers, clean and fresh, more readily available than it had been during the final weeks inside the pocket. The casual provision of water, something so basic yet so precious in combat conditions, spoke volumes about American logistical capabilities. Processing began in early afternoon when American personnel started calling prisoners forward in groups organized by unit and rank. Officers were separated from enlisted men for separate processing. Schafer found himself standing in line with other German captains and majors, waiting his turn to be photographed, fingerprinted, and interrogated. The photography equipment was sophisticated, producing clear images within moments. The fingerprinting was done on cards that were part of a clearly established system for tracking prisoners. Every detail was recorded with careful attention to accuracy and completeness. The interrogation was conducted by an American captain who spoke fluent German with a slight Austrian accent. He asked routine questions about Schafer's unit, its strength, its recent movements, and its combat activities. Nothing seemed particularly pressing or urgent about the questions. The American officer was gathering information systematically, adding Schafer's responses to what was clearly an already substantial body of intelligence about German forces in the Ruhr pocket. The interrogation was professional, even cordial, with no threats or intimidation. When Schafer answered questions, the American simply noted the responses and moved on to the next question. The whole process took perhaps 20 minutes. After interrogation came medical screening, another demonstration of American thoroughness and resources. German prisoners were examined by American medics who checked for wounds, diseases, and general health conditions. The medical equipment was modern and well-maintained. Supplies were used without apparent concern for conservation. Prisoners with wounds received treatment immediately, regardless of how minor the injuries might be. The medics worked with professional competence, treating German prisoners with the same care they would presumably show to American casualties. For men accustomed to German field medicine that had been increasingly compromised by supply shortages, this level of medical attention was remarkable. Schafer watched the processing operation with growing comprehension of what it represented. The Americans were not just defeating German forces militarily. They were systematically absorbing hundreds of thousands of prisoners into an administrative system that had been prepared in advance to handle exactly this situation. Someone had planned for mass surrenders, had established procedures for processing prisoners, had allocated resources for feeding and housing captured enemy soldiers. The level of foresight and organizational capacity required for such planning was difficult to comprehend for someone who had watched German logistics collapse under the strain of prolonged warfare. As evening approached, the prisoners were organized into larger groups for transportation to more permanent facilities. American personnel announced that the prisoners would be moved to camps in France, where they would await final disposition. The announcement was made in German by American interpreters who had been assigned specifically for communication with prisoners. Even this detail, the provision of interpreters in adequate numbers to communicate with thousands of prisoners, demonstrated resources and planning that impressed Schafer despite his situation. The Americans had thought of everything, had prepared for every contingency and had the resources to implement their plans regardless of scale. The trucks that arrived for the longer journey were different from the combat vehicles that had brought them from the surrender point. These were designed for troop transport, with more comfortable seating and better suspension. The prisoners were loaded efficiently, with American personnel ensuring that everyone was accounted for and properly documented. The manifests were checked and rechecked, with multiple copies distributed to different parts of the American administrative system. Nothing was left to chance or improvisation. Everything followed established procedures that worked smoothly despite the unprecedented numbers of prisoners being processed. The journey west took most of the night, with the convoy stopping periodically for rest breaks and prisoner welfare. At each stop, American guards maintained security while allowing prisoners to stretch, use field latrines, and receive water. The organization was impeccable. Supply trucks accompanied the convoy, carrying rations and equipment needed for prisoner care. Medical vehicles were interspersed through the convoy, ready to respond to any health emergencies. Communication vehicles maintained contact with higher command, ensuring that the convoy's progress was monitored and coordinated with other elements of the prisoner processing system. Schafer dozed fitfully during the journey, wedged between his sergeants in the crowded truck bed. His sleep was troubled by dreams of combat and retreat, memories of battles fought and lost, of orders given and obeyed, of the slow realization everything he had believed about the war was wrong. He woke periodically to find the truck still moving through the darkness, carrying him away from Germany and toward an uncertain future in American captivity. Each time he woke, he found himself thinking about the casual efficiency with which the Americans handled every aspect of prisoner management. This was not improvisation. This was the expression of a society that had the resources and organizational capacity to maintain systematic control over hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners while simultaneously conducting offensive operations across Europe. Dawn found the convoy crossing into what had been France just months earlier, now firmly under Allied control and transformed into a massive support base for American military operations. The landscape showed evidence of war in damaged buildings and cratered fields, but it also showed evidence of American reconstruction efforts. Roads had been repaired and were carrying heavy military traffic. Railway lines had been restored and were operating with apparent efficiency. Temporary structures housed American logistics operations that supplied the advancing armies. Everything spoke of capabilities that exceeded anything Germany had been able to maintain even at the height of its power. The convoy arrived at a large prisoner of war camp outside the city of Chartres in mid-morning. The camp sprawled across what had been farmland, now enclosed by wire fencing and organized into precise rows of barracks and administrative buildings. Guard towers stood at regular intervals along the perimeter, manned by American soldiers who watched the surrounding area with casual alertness. The entrance gate bore signs in English, French, and German, identifying the facility as a prisoner of war camp operated under Geneva Convention guidelines. Even this detail, the multilingual signage, suggested planning and resources that impressed, despite its apparent simplicity. Processing at the camp entrance was thorough and methodical. German prisoners were counted and checked against manifests. Names were verified, documentation was examined and added to camp files. Each prisoner received an identification number that would be used throughout their captivity. The process took hours as thousands of men moved through the administrative pipeline, but it never broke down or descended into chaos. American personnel simply worked through the requirements with systematic persistence, processing each prisoner completely before moving to the next. The barracks were basic but adequate, wooden structures with bunks, heating stoves, and minimal furnishings. Each building was designed to house 50 men, with space allocated for personal belongings and common areas. The buildings were weatherproof and solid, far superior to the field accommodations the German soldiers had endured during the final months of the war. Windows provided light and ventilation. Doors could be secured for privacy. The camp layout included latrines and washing facilities that maintained basic sanitation standards. Nothing was luxurious, but everything was functional and maintained in working order. Schafer and his company were assigned to Barracks 14 in the camp's northern sector. They claimed bunks and settled in with the weary relief of men who had survived something terrible and could finally rest. The barracks quickly filled with conversation as German soldiers from different units began sharing their experiences of surrender and captivity. Common themes emerged from these conversations. The Americans were efficient but not cruel. Food was adequate and regularly provided. Medical care was available for those who needed it. The systematic organization of camp life was impressive even to men who came from a military culture that prided itself on discipline and order. The first meal in American captivity came in late afternoon when prisoners were called to the camp mess facility. Schafer joined the line with thousands of other German prisoners moving slowly toward long
tables where American personnel served food from large containers. What appeared on his metal tray left him momentarily stunned, unable to process what he was seeing. There was meat, actual meat that had been properly prepared and cooked. There were potatoes that had not been mixed with substitute fillers. There was bread that was made from real wheat flour. There was even coffee, genuine coffee that smelled like the beverage he remembered from before the war. He carried his tray to a rough wooden table and sat down with his sergeants, all of them staring at their food with expressions that mixed disbelief with something approaching grief. This was more food than they had seen in months, better food than German civilians were receiving, served to enemy prisoners with casual efficiency by an army that apparently had so many resources that feeding hundreds of thousands of captured soldiers posed no significant burden. Schafer picked up his fork and began eating slowly, trying to make sense of what this abundance meant about the society that had defeated him. The food was not just adequate, it was good, prepared with attention to taste and nutrition that seemed impossible for mass feeding of prisoners. The meat was tender and properly seasoned, the potatoes were fresh and well cooked, the bread had flavor and texture that reminded him of pre-war civilian baking. The coffee was strong and rich, a stark contrast to the bitter substitutes that had been German rations for years. Each bite, each sip reinforced a realization that was becoming impossible to avoid. Germany had not just lost a war. Germany had been defeated by a civilization that operated on completely different principles of organization and resource allocation. Around him, thousands of German prisoners were having similar realizations as they consumed American rations. Men who had been starving just days earlier now sat with full trays and second helpings available if they wanted more. The contrast with German circumstances was so extreme that it created cognitive dissonance. How could this be possible? How could an army that was fighting across multiple continents simultaneously feed enemy prisoners better than Germany fed its own civilians? The answer was obvious and devastating. American productive capacity and organizational ability exceeded German capabilities so completely that the comparison was meaningless. As darkness fell across Camp Chart, Schafer lay in his bunk and tried to process everything he had experienced since surrendering that morning. Less than 24 hours had passed since he led his company out of the Ruhr pocket under a white flag. In that brief time, he had been processed through an administrative system that handled mass surrenders with systematic efficiency, transported hundreds of kilometers across war-torn territory without incident, and delivered to a camp where he was housed, fed, and treated according to international law. Everything had worked exactly as it apparently should work according to American planning and procedures. The casual competence of American operations was perhaps more disturbing than outright cruelty would have been. Schafer could have understood brutality. He could have maintained his sense of German superiority in the face of vengeful treatment by victorious enemies. But the systematic humanitarianism backed by overwhelming resources challenged every assumption he had held about the war and the societies fighting it. The Americans were not just militarily superior.
They were organizationally and morally superior, demonstrating capabilities that suggested fundamental differences in how societies could be structured and operated. Sleep came slowly that night, troubled by questions that had no comfortable answers. What did it mean that Germany had chosen to fight such an enemy? What did it say about the German state that it had led its people into a war against a power with such overwhelming advantages? How had the propaganda been so completely wrong about American weakness and degeneracy?
He had encountered were not soft or undisciplined. They were casual and informal in manner, but beneath that informality was iron-hard competence and resources that seemed limitless. They had defeated Germany not through superior courage or ideology, but through superior organization and industrial capacity that made German efforts seem futile in retrospect. The next morning brought new surprises as camp routine began and German prisoners discovered the full extent of American planning for their captivity. Breakfast was served early with portions that matched the previous evening's abundance. American personnel moved through the barracks distributing information sheets in German that explained camp rules, prisoner rights under the Geneva Convention, and schedules for various activities. The information was clear, comprehensive, and printed on quality paper using professional printing equipment. Even this mundane detail spoke to resources and planning that impressed. After breakfast, prisoners were organized into work details for camp maintenance and administration. The work was not harsh or punishing. It was simply the normal labor required to maintain a facility housing thousands of men. Prisoners cleaned barracks, maintained grounds, assisted with food service, and helped with various logistical tasks. American supervisors assigned work with attention to prisoners' skills and physical condition, ensuring that labor was distributed fairly and that no one was given tasks beyond their capabilities. The organization of these work details demonstrated planning and administrative ability that rivaled anything in German military tradition. Schafer was assigned to an administrative detail, assisting with prisoner records management. The work involved filing documents, maintaining logs, and helping track the thousands of German prisoners flowing through the American system. It gave him direct exposure to the scale and sophistication of American prisoner management capabilities. Files were maintained for each prisoner with comprehensive information about their capture, health status, and personal background. These files were typed using multiple carbon copies distributed to different parts of the administrative system. Cross-reference systems allowed rapid location of information about any specific prisoner. The whole operation functioned with efficiency that would have been admirable in any bureaucracy, but was remarkable for a military organization dealing with unprecedented numbers of prisoners during active combat operations. Working alongside American personnel provided further insights into the society that had defeated Germany. The Americans were young, educated, and startlingly informal in their interactions. They called each other by first names, regardless of rank in casual situations. They joked and laughed while working. They treated German prisoners with professional courtesy, but without the harsh formality that characterized German military culture. This informality initially seemed like weakness or lack of discipline to Schafer, but as he observed longer, he began to understand that it reflected confidence and internalized competence. The Americans did not need rigid hierarchy and harsh discipline because they had been trained and equipped so thoroughly that everyone understood their roles and responsibilities without constant supervision. The American Guards rotated regularly, replaced by fresh units that arrived with clean uniforms and good equipment. These rotations followed schedules that were posted in advance and executed precisely as planned. The logistics required to rotate Guard forces while maintaining security and continuing operations were considerable, yet the Americans managed it without apparent difficulty. Supplies arrived regularly on transport trucks that followed predictable schedules. Food, fuel, medical supplies, administrative materials all flowed into the camp with clockwork precision. Nothing was ever exhausted or unavailable. If something ran low, more arrived before shortages could develop into problems. Medical facilities at the camp provided superb care.
Another window into American capabilities and values. A fully equipped hospital occupied several barracks in the southern sector, staffed by American medical personnel who treated German prisoners with the same professional care they would provide to American casualties. Schafer visited the hospital after developing an infected cut on his hand from work duty. An American doctor examined him, cleaned the wound with antiseptic that stung but worked effectively, and bandaged it with clean materials. The entire process took perhaps 10 minutes and involved medical supplies that would have been precious in German facilities. The doctor explained the treatment in adequate German, told Schafer to return if the infection did not improve, and sent him back to his barracks with casual professionalism that demonstrated how routine such care was in American military culture. Days turned into weeks as Schafer settled into the routine of prisoner life. The initial shock of American abundance gradually faded into acceptance as he adapted to circumstances that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. He was being housed, fed, and treated humanely by an enemy that had every reason to hate Germany for the destruction its armies had caused across Europe. This humanitarian treatment was not occasional or exceptional. It was systematic, the standard operating procedure for American forces dealing with hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The consistency of this treatment spoke to values that were deeply embedded in American society and military culture. Letters began arriving from home, forwarded through the Red Cross system that maintained contact between prisoners and their families. Schafer received his first letter from his wife in late April, a brief note that had been written weeks earlier and had traveled through multiple checkpoints before reaching him. She wrote of conditions in Germany that were dire beyond description. Food was nearly impossible to obtain. Fuel for heating was non-existent. Cities were ruins. The government had collapsed completely. Soviet forces occupied the eastern territories with brutal efficiency, while American and British forces held the west. Germany itself had ceased to exist as a functioning state. Reading her words while sitting in an American camp, eating regular meals and sleeping in a weatherproof barracks created feelings of guilt and confusion that Schafer struggled to process. He wrote back carefully, aware that his letter would be censored by American personnel before being sent. He could not tell her everything about his captivity, or about what he had learned regarding American capabilities. But he tried to reassure her that he was safe, that he was being treated well, and that he hoped to return home when the Americans decided to release prisoners. What he could not write, what he barely dared think, was that being a prisoner in American custody was preferable to being a civilian in defeated Germany. This realization created psychological conflicts that were difficult to acknowledge and impossible to resolve. Other prisoners at Camp Chart were having similar experiences and reaching similar conclusions. Conversations in the barracks at night often turned to comparisons between their current situation and conditions in Germany. Men who had fought desperately to avoid American captivity now acknowledged that surrender had likely saved their lives. The American ability to feed and house hundreds of thousands of prisoners while simultaneously occupying and administering Germany suggested resources and organizational capabilities that had no parallel in German experience. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.